The other day I was speaking about experience, and I didn't actually get to the point that I was trying to make because it became apparent. I started talking about experience in a different context to what I intended to be referring to experience as. Um, the word experience, as I use it, means what is arising in this moment. So life, what we call daily life or your life, is always a present moment experience. And so what do we mean by experience? Experience isn't something that comes into life like the taste of a strawberry, and then the taste is a nice experience. The taste is part of a bigger experience that is always present, at least always present when we are in the waking state. And you might be able to see how it's still an experience in when we are dreaming. The dream has replaced the waking experience. So the dream experience has replaced the waking experience. The waking experience has collapsed, and the dream experience is arising. And if we look at it like that, that actually the waking experience and the dream experience are the two different sorts of experience that we can have, we might realize, and that they're happening in the same place, actually. We might realize that what we call the waking state is an experience arising in consciousness, whereas it feels like it's an experience happening outside of me. Or outside of me. And what I'm suggesting is that is an experience. Daily life is an experience designed to have that sense to it, the sense that I am a body, I am a person, and that there is a world outside of me. All of that is experienced because it is how the experience is constructed. And I think it's fair to say that you and I don't actively construct the experience consciously. Otherwise, we would be aware of having spent a lot of time working on where everything in the experience is going to be, and it sort of just appears, and we appear in the experience. So when I talk about experience, I'm not talking about experience as being ignorance and the opposite of knowing reality, and then we can know reality, and that is not experience, that is truth. Or so yesterday or the day before, when I was talking about experience, I was talking about how some teachings refer to experience as a subset of what we can know as daily life, and it is, in a sense, the ignorant experience, the experience of knowing oneself or not knowing oneself. And then when a certain awakening happens, experience falls away and we're left with reality or truth. Where I'm saying what we're left with when what is referred to as reality or truth, or knowing life as it really is, knowing the non-duality of life, is just a different experience, constructed differently to feel different. And in that different experience, certain components are missing, other components are present. And so the experience qualitatively feels different. There can be a sense that what I am is outside of the body, not the body, but sort of like a out of body experience. And I am that which is outside the body, not the body. Whereas a different, what we might call the everyday, normal, vanilla daily life experience is the experience where there is the sense in the experience, I am the body and I am aware of life from the point of view of the body. And they're different. Clearly, they're different. You can take some drugs and who knows what the effect is. Some of the effects are strange shifts in the experience. And I guess I'm just trying to point out that if we can notice that these big shifts, if they happen for us, are not really that important, what would be quite important is to realize that they are all experience, that life is experience, and that experience can be constructed very differently, and that we're not the ones constructing the experience. So the experience of daily life, or the present moment experience, visual component of the experience. So we call it a thought and emotion experience. Multisensory, meaning several senses: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. So if you were to get rid of the sight component, the visual component of the experience, the experience as a whole would change quite radically. So imagine, just, you can be you don't need to imagine, be present with the present moment experience, that which is here for you right now. So for the most part, most people are sitting in a room, and that's the sense, that's the experience. The experience is creating the sense that I am the body, the person, sitting on a chair in a room, and the room has walls and there is space. It's a experience of space and time. It takes seconds for me to move my hand from one side to the other, and it requires space in which my hand moves. So it is an experience of time and space, an experience of form, an experience of a world of time and space and form being experienced by a person. That's how the experience feels. Now, some of us, some of you at different times will say, oh, actually, that's not how my experience is at the moment. My experience is qualitatively different. And so that's quite possible. That's what I'm suggesting, is that there will always be a present moment experience, constructed and feeling qualitatively exactly the way it has been created in that moment to be experienced. So we're looking at the components of the experience so that we don't focus on experience, thinking experience means something very specific, when in fact what I'm pointing at is something broader as an experience. So you can see it's a multi-sensory experience. There's the visual component of the experience. So space and form require objects, and by and large, a lot of our experience of the world is visual. It's a very big component of the momentary experience. So look around the room. Actually look around, because we tend to get caught in concepts. And awareness, attention can land on the objects in the present moment experience. And it's a multi-sensory experience. So if you want to lick one of the objects, you'll find if you lick it, there will be a sense of touch and maybe some taste. So the book is a visual component. It has a taste component. If you lick it, if you pick it up with your hands, there is touch. All of that is part of the experience. And you might have a thought about the book when you pick it up. Oh, it's heavier than I thought. That thought is part of the experience. And if you licked the book, you might find it sends a shiver down, and you might remember having licked a book when you were 5 years old, and a nostalgic emotion can come up. And so that emotion is also part of the experience. So it's a multi-sensory, emotional, thought experience. You could look at it as many layers. We could call them layers of, you could look at the visual layer as an object and the sound layer as an object. So if you are present with the experience, you might hear birds singing or cars driving past, people talking, dogs barking. That's the sound component of the experience. So you could imagine the sound component being removed from the experience. So if someone suddenly went deaf temporarily for 30 seconds, there is a moment, the present moment experience that has no sound, like the volume has been turned down. So now it is still a multi-sensory thought, emotion experience, but without the sound objects present. And if someone went temporarily blind, then as well as deaf, then there would be an experience, but with no whatever's cooking in the kitchen is that sense intensifies. So there's an experience, and that component of the experience, the smell component, has become sort of a bigger component than it might normally be. That might be something that just suddenly happens to someone. They go temporarily deaf, temporarily blind, and smell becomes very intense. And let's say it's part of their seeking process. So you could say that's a peak experience. Peak experience meaning it's unusual, and say it demonstrates something to that person, which the person is really part and parcel of the experience. And an insight happens. It's like, oh, there are these layers of experience, sensory layers to the experience. And so that might be what that peak experience is about, just demonstrating something. And so many peak experiences are there for us to essentially learn or see something about experience that we don't normally get to see, that we don't, that is maybe not obvious because of the mix of how the experience is put together. And so in a peak experience, something tends to become intensified, magnified. A certain component of experience is magnified, or a certain contrast happens. And in a way that's there to demonstrate something to us. It's a way of us becoming aware. So the peak experiences are there, and they're not necessarily, what I would say is truth. I'd say they're not really any more true than the experience that was before that and the experience that will be after it. It's just a change in the construct of the experience. Why, or what often happens is people have, seekers have these shifts, and a layer of experience, a layer of the experience falls away. And if that layer that falls away is a particularly relative layer, a layer that is a sort of lens, a very subjective, relative lens, then the experience can feel much less subjective. So let's say thinking and knowing the experience through a lens of thought, but that lens of thought is actually part of the experience, where the objects are being experienced at a distance, let's say. So the table is outside of the one experiencing it, and we're sort of experiencing the table in relative terms, where it's being seen and we might have some ideas about the table, and it has a certain feel. The experience of knowing the table is the experience of knowing the table from a particular perspective. That's how the experience has been created, to follow certain rules that say, okay, from the perspective of the body, it is going to feel a certain way. The table is going to be known as the table is known from the perspective of the body. And then a certain change happens. And let's say the experience is in that moment created not to be felt and experienced from the perspective of the body, but from a perspective that feels like it's outside of the body. And as a result of the experience being constructed that way, certain faculties that are present in the previous experience aren't there. And if those faculties are faculties that are relative faculties, like thinking, and suddenly it's not there in the experience will feel less relative. It is less relative in a sense because a layer of relative thinking is absent. And then a mistake is made where we say, this is the absolute. Whereas in fact, it's just that it's an experience with a layer of relativity missing. So it feels more absolute because it's less relative, because that layer, and relative really means probably means seeing it, knowing it from a very specific perspective, a subjective perspective. And if the experience is created and known from a less subjective experience, it feels less subjective. And we might think that it is completely not subjective, that it has changed in nature from being subjective to being known absolutely. And there are certain qualities of the awakened experience, if you want to call it that, where certain thinking has fallen away. There are certain qualities that make it seem that it's absolute. It just isn't constructed to be an experience of duality. And because the teachings have been talking about the nature of life as non-dual, and that is the truth, and that knowing life as dual, as duality, is the, and that duality is experience, and the end of duality is the end of experience. And experience is often in those teachings referred to as subject-object relationship, and that's known as not knowing yourself, because it's coming from the perspective of being the person and the body, and therefore experiencing the world from the perspective of the person, and you are the teachings are saying you are not that. You are that which is aware of all of the objects, and the body is just another object of experience. You can see the visual component of the experience includes the body, the touch experience of the touch object part of the experience is what makes the body seem present. And so there is an encouragement to be aware of life from the point of view of awareness and not the body. And that as opposed to a dual experience, an experience of non-duality, as opposed to the experience of duality. Now, some people, some seekers, and the end of duality means the end of experience. That when I say the experience of non-duality, there's a short circuit happening in their brain. It's like my language, because I'm saying both duality and non-duality are just two qualitatively different daily life experiences. It isn't a shift from illusion to reality. They are both present moment experiences that arise and are experienced the way the whole experience is. If awareness seems to shift out of the body, it hasn't really shifted out of the body. What's happened is there was an experience where awareness was in the body. So like a frame on the cartoon where the sound was coming out of the roadrunner's mouth. He was beep, beep. And the sound was specifically linked to the roadrunner in the way that that frame is constructed. And then the next frame seems like the beep, beep is moving out of the body. And it's just a different frame constructed where the beep, beep is not linked to the body. And it can feel like, oh, awareness has shifted outside of the body. And now life is known truly. And I'm suggesting they're two different experiences constructed exactly the way they're experienced. Now, why is that important? It's important so that we can start to maybe investigate the present moment experience. And that really means just be aware of objects arising in the present moment experience. So if we don't have an appreciation of what the present moment experience is, if it hasn't been explained, then I can be talking about suffering arising in the present moment experience, and we wonder what does that mean? Or pleasure and pain in the present moment experience. Or I would say pleasure and pain in the flow of life. So the flow of life is really contained in the present moment experience. That's the only place that we have ever known life, is as it arises as part of the present moment experience. So if you put your hand under cold water, the whole thing, your hand moving through the air to turn on the tap, and then cupping your hands and then filling with water and then splashing it on your face, all of that is the present moment experience. There really, from one perspective, there isn't a body and water and a tap. There is the experience of a body, water, and a tap, and the body moves exactly as it is dictated to move within the experience. So if you were to put on some virtual experience, what's it called? Virtual reality goggles. As technology gets better and better, there will be an experience inside the technology, inside the goggles, or however it works. An experience is being presented, has been created, and consciousness, the consciousness functioning through the body, links into that experience and pervades the experience with consciousness. And once really the experience hasn't been created, the various components of the experience are created by the technology development company, let's say. But it requires consciousness to be aware of those components. If they're without the human consciousness inserted into the goggles, there is no experience. There's the visual part, but no awareness of it. So once the goggles are put in, that experience essentially replaces the daily life experience. And it will be experienced exactly the way it's constructed and based on how the consciousness and all of the components of the experience arise in that moment. So the daily life experience is exactly that, an experience. And we need to be able to explore it in order to come to a better understanding of what life is and what the human being is and what time is and what space is and what pleasure is and what pain is and what suffering is, what the thinking mind is, what a biological reaction is, what a psychological reaction is, what consciousness is, what awareness is, what guilt, blame, pride, worry, expectation is, what attachment to outcome is, what the thinking mind is, what the working mind is, what the other is, what the me idea is, the psychological identity is, what I am is. All of that stuff is contained in the present moment experience. So all of those concepts, they too are arising in the present moment experience. So my words are part of your present moment experience. They are the sound component, part of the sound component of the present moment experience. And then there is a thinking component that is somewhat correlated to, let's say, what's happening in the present moment experience. And the thinking is also part of the experience. And all of this experience is registered by awareness. If you take awareness away, if we have a button that we press that is the off button, the awareness off button, then all the sound components, all the visual components, all the thought components, all the emotion components collapse. The experience collapses because experience is interdependent with awareness. You can't have an experience without awareness being there. as the fundamental essence of experience. So that's one of the major components that we may bump into, which really means that may present itself in a shift from one moment to the other, which is basically the experience changing. And when the experience changes from one moment to the next, what might become evident is the awareness component. So what is known as an awakening experience, and at least I've got that on my side, it's referred to in spiritual seeking as an awakening experience. And that awakening experience is what is referred to as knowing reality. So at least we have something pointing to the fact that, awakening or knowing oneself as consciousness or source or awareness or whatever you want to say is referred to as an awakening experience. So in that moment when the awakening experience happens, what might be evident, what might be magnified, just like in the earlier example where I said the sense of smell or the smell objects are magnified, in a particular shift from one qualitative sense experience to another, the awareness aspect is magnified, is shown, is brought to the front of the stage. It's like, okay, now we are going to parade awareness on the stage. And in that moment, it's like, oh, awareness is that which is aware of the whole experience. In fact, the whole experience arises in awareness, is pervaded by awareness, is made of awareness, is witnessed by awareness, and awareness is not separate from the experience. Awareness is not separate from the objects, which are really experience. It's all experience. Life is experience. The background of experience is consciousness or awareness. And then we say, oh, well, when we're trying to highlight, we'll call it the background. And then the experience can morph, not necessarily in that moment, but as our seeking carries on, then the spiritual pointers come in and they say, well, it's not really a background. It's a foreground. It's a container of awareness in which the whole experience arises. And then we stop calling it a background of awareness because it doesn't seem like it's just the background, but it's all pervading. And our understanding can shift from there being awareness and objects, and awareness being ever present, unchanging. That's how it's described in order for the experience to change. And when that shift happens, it's like, oh, there is the background of awareness, and then there are all the objects that come and go. And the experience, experience objects, the visual objects, the sound objects, are always changing, and awareness is unchanging. And that's duality, isn't it? That's another form of where our perception and our interpretation brings in duality. And so then we're sort of encouraged to start seeing, well, the book is not outside of awareness. And the book is not in the forefront of a background of awareness, but rather awareness and the book are not two. That awareness and the book are interconnected. They're interdependent. The book is essentially made of awareness. And from that point of view, we say, wow, if the book is changing and the book and awareness are not two, then maybe awareness is not as unchanging as I experienced it. Now, I thought that was, the experience of reality. So how can we then change our notion of it And how can the experience of it change, where at first it presents as a background of awareness, and then it's like, oh, it's not quite a background, it's more that awareness pervades all the objects. And then the experience can change again as our seeking continues, as things continue to get refined. So life is an ongoing experience, and all these peak experiences and what are referred to as the falling away of illusion, if it's an experiential shift, then it's just a change in the qualitative nature of the experience, and it's going to change again. And even, when it sets in and says, no, why it's not experience is because I am that resting in, I am the awareness that is always aware of the experience. And so I am sort of outside of experience. And that's a particular standpoint that seeking puts in place. And hopefully a teaching comes along and says, you're not meant to live like that. Integrated living is not about living in that experience. And let's keep it practical. Why? What are you really looking for? In practical terms, we're looking for the end of suffering. That's what started our seeking. Our seeking started because life was suffering. And then teaching said, oh, life is suffering because you don't know yourself truly. And the teachings then said, you are awareness, not the body. And so that happened. And then we think, okay, that happened, and that's what it's all about. The teachings were telling me that's what it's all about. But didn't we start off seeking because of suffering? Yes, but suffering falls away when we know ourselves truly. Oh, so how come suffering is still arising? Actually, it's not about the end of suffering. It's about witnessing and being awareness. And who cares about what the content is? What's important is to know yourself truly. So is it? Like, why do you want to know yourself truly? Doesn't there have to be a practical benefit? And often what we find is that for a while we think there's a practical benefit in knowing ourselves as awareness because we've achieved the Holy Grail. And so it's like, oh, I've had success in my seeking because this shift has happened. Now that won't really last for very long, because that's actually an egoic sense of achievement, where we go, finally, I haven't been so successful in a whole lot of things in my life, but this I've managed to be successful at. And so there can actually be a defending of the fact it's about a shift in awareness and not about the end of suffering, because the end of suffering is still happening and the shift has happened. So if I say it was about the end of suffering, then I have to give up my achievement, because then I say, oh, well, I don't have the end of suffering, but I do have the shift. So let me make it about the shift. That will last for and be acceptable for a little bit. The truth is, if suffering continues, it'll soon get tiring, and we'll wonder, when is it really going to happen in the way that is satisfying, that makes life feel okay on an ongoing basis? And so that witnessing can very much be part of the ongoing movement, but there needs to be a surrender on the part of the seeker that says, actually, let's keep it practical. That's the suggestion. And keeping it practical means, in practical terms, what are we looking for? In practical terms, we're looking for happiness, and happiness is the end of suffering. And that we can call continuous, unbroken peace of mind. And so if someone has had the shift and after a period of time, if the suffering is still there, they'll say, who am I kidding? Like the suffering is, life is still suffering. And and the shift has happened, and yet it's still suffering. So is it really, is that enough? And the truth is that the movement towards the end of suffering can happen without a pronounced shift where experientially we know life completely radically different, that the system can be loosened up. And then it's about moving on past that point. It may require us to move past that point in order to find that some delusions that set in actually fall away, where we, for a period of time said, I'm not the body. The body is just an object doing its stuff. I am awareness, witnessing the body doing its stuff. And after a while, if that's not correct, if you actually are somewhat, part of you is the body, having the notion that you're not the body is not going to deliver harmony, because it's a form of ignorance. It's a lack of clarity. I am not the person. I say, yes, you are. And the person can change. The person can be a person suffering arising as part of the experience, or the experience can be I'm a person and suffering not arising. And the experience of a person is such that the person also has characteristics, such as the characteristic of, or the facet, the dimension of awareness. And so that awakening is an awakening to a facet of the person that wasn't appreciated. And for as long as the seeker is still saying, I am awareness, aware of the body, and I am not the body, to me, that's where the seeking process is delivering a familiarity with that awareness aspect. It is moving the seeker through a sadhana, part of the process, a sadhana which is for a particular phase, the sadhana of becoming familiar with the formless awareness aspect. And in order to become familiar with it and to understand in order for the experience to be there, so in order for there to be an appreciation that without awareness present, without consciousness present, they're interchangeable words in the way I use them, or rather awareness is an aspect of consciousness, is one of the two primary aspects of consciousness. Awareness and the sense of I am. In order for us to realize that daily life experience is completely dependent on awareness, and that the sense of I am is one component of awareness that remains ever present all the time. Now, the sense I am is not the thought I am. It's not the thinking, I am this, I need that. That's the thought I am that turns into the me identity. The actual feeling, the sense of existence, is the accompanying facet of consciousness, the accompanying facet to the awareness facet of consciousness. And so for that to be appreciated, some seekers' sadhana includes an extended period of resting as formless awareness, as presence. And for a while, mistaking themselves to be presence. And then an integrating of that understanding can happen. An integrating into living as a human being, living as the person. And as that integration happens, the person has a fundamental dimension to them, which is the dimension or the layer of consciousness, awareness. And the person, the human being, also has the layer of form and body. It has the emotional layer. It has the feeling layer. It has the thought layer. And all of those layers need to be acknowledged as making up the totality of the person. And then we can understand that in each moment, the experience have maybe with some of those layers not present, where they in effect fall away, for the momentary experience to be the way it is. So in a moment of meditation, the person, to me, still includes all of those layers, the layer of awareness, the layer of form, the layer of feelings, the layer of emotion, the layer of thoughts. But the present moment experience might be such that the layer of form falls away. The layer of emotion falls away. The layer of thought might fall away. The layer of form may not fall away completely because sound might still be present. Sound is, you could say, one of the components of form. And then even the sound could fall away in a subsequent, as the experience, the meditation experience morphs. And what you might find in the meditation experience is there is just the sense of I am, existence, the actual sense. So if I ask someone meditating if they could hear me, and I say, "Are you dead?" They don't need to think about it. It's like they just, if there is the presence with the experience, there is this undeniable sense, I am, I exist. So I am not dead is what it's not a concept where you have to think about coming up with a conceptual answer. You just go to the experience, the undeniable sense that what I am is undefined in terms of form, because that form layer has fallen away. Thoughts have fallen away, emotions have fallen away. And what remains is this formless sense of existence and awareness of the sense of existence. And so the intuitive answer is no, I am. And so in that momentary experience, that's still a personal experience. It's still the experience of a person. It's just that many layers of the person have been turned off, if you like. And then the meditation experience, as I've described, changes to daily life experience. Again, so the visual components flood the space that was previously a space of primarily no time and space, because a lot of the sense of time and space is dependent on the objects, the visual objects, the sound objects, the thought objects. They are what create the sense of time and space. That doesn't mean that time and space doesn't exist independent of our thinking about time and space, but our conceptualization and our experience of time and space is based on objects of experience. I'd say time actually exists independent of our thinking about time. And so seeing that nuance where we can see that there is the concept of time, and that concept of that experience of time is brought into existence by objects that create the notion of space and movement, which creates the notion of time, and memory of the past and projection into the future that creates a sense of time. But do we know that time doesn't actually exist independent of those experiences of time? We don't. So now, if I'm saying that life is all experience, someone will say, well, the person doesn't exist, because the person is really just experience. The body is object experience. The thoughts are thought objects in experience. So there really is no person. I wouldn't go that far. I'd say, firstly, there is the experience of a person. Where that experience comes from, whether that experience is a reflection of a world that actually does exist, and the experience that we have is a reflection of that world, we don't know. I think you might as well live as if that's the case, that our experience of the world is a reflection of an actual objective world. And even if it isn't, at some point we say, well, even if this is an elaborate experience, an elaborate virtual reality, the point is not to see it as a virtual reality, because frankly, if you see it as a virtual reality, you might be going too far, because it might not be a virtual reality. It might be an experience picked up because of a body aware of an actual external world. So anyone who tells me you're completely wrong in holding the notion that the experience of life may be a reflection of an actual world that exists, an objective world that exists, to me is still lost in the phase of appreciating that life is experience. And often, in order for that appreciation to happen, spiritual teachings will tell you there is only the experience. There is nothing outside of the experience. And that's there as a concept to bring attention into the experience so that the experience can be appreciated. At some point, our thinking says, how do I know that the experience is not a reflection of an actual objective world? How do I know that my experience of the book, which I know is an experience dependent on awareness, how do I know that that experience of a book isn't because there actually is a book? And how do I know that the experience of the body, which I can't deny is an experience, along with the whole daily life experience, that's all experience. I can't deny that. But I don't know whether it's a virtual creation of source that has said there is nothing and I'm going to create an experience and that's all there is, the experience, or whether it's an experience which is a reflection of an objective world that exists. If someone tells me they know that there is just the experience and nothing outside of the experience, I understand why they say that. And I say it's wrong to say that. They might be right, but not because they know they're right, because they're making a mistake in not seeing the possibility that there is a world from where the experience comes. So I'm not saying there is an objective world. I'm saying you can't know. And so if someone tells me all there is the experience and there's nothing outside of the experience, that's because they still believe a teaching concept that was put forward in order for them to become aware of life as an experience. And in order for that to happen, the teaching said there is nothing outside of the experience, there is just experience. Now, I know that's a teaching concept. We have to go beyond the teaching concepts once they've done their job. And so if someone is convinced that there is just experience and nothing outside of experience, then that teaching concept has become the thorn embedded in the thumb that Ramana has warned us against. Use this concept to remove the concept embedded in your thumb, or use this thorn to remove the thorn that's embedded in your thumb, but then be sure to throw both thorns away. And the thorn embedded in one's thumb was the not appreciating daily life experience as being an experience dependent on awareness of the experience. And so the teaching said, there is nothing outside of experience. And that is the thorn used to uproot the non-recognition that life is an experience. So it also provided a whole lot of other concepts, which was the thorn to basically uproot the fact that we relate to life as if it is an objective reality and miss the fact it's an experience. So that gets sorted. And then the concepts that helped us see that get put in place. And then we relate to life as if it is only an experience and say there's nothing, which is going too far. So anyway, what's all the point of all of this? The point is to say that once we awaken to what is the present moment experience, then we have to come to the conclusion, actually, that's not the purpose. The purpose isn't to know that it's all experience, but it's to live the experience in very practical terms. It's to live in this virtual world if it's a virtual world. And if it's not a virtual world, if there's an objective world, it's to live in the objective world as it keeps presenting. So way, if it's a virtual reality, waking up to it doesn't dissolve the virtual reality. We don't wake up and then find ourselves in some other world and everyone's clapping, going, well done, you solved the problem. Waking up means you remain in this life. And so then we go, maybe this life is about living this life fully, not as awareness, aware of the body as an object, but we might actually start keeping it practical and say, actually, this experience, this virtual reality, if that's what it is a virtual reality of me being the body. So that's after the awakening where we know ourselves as formless awareness. Teaching will say, hey, but are you not, didn't you, the body, get on a plane to fly to India to listen to the guru giving you the spiritual teaching that you are not the body? And then didn't you fly back? You go, no, I was the witness, the awareness, aware of the body getting on the plane, all of that. Okay, but maybe there's a more concrete link between the awareness and the body. Isn't that body always there? And isn't it experiencing life? And isn't what awareness is aware of, isn't it aware of it from the perspective of the body? So maybe the awareness and the body are not as separate as we might have. And it's like, oh, so really the point of life is to live life fully as a human being, as a person? Yes, but free of suffering. So the point is to go from a person that has an experience of life full of suffering to a person who's living life as a person, claiming, I am Roger, the person, but free of suffering. And when we look at this and we say, okay, so if that's what life's about, the end of suffering, or not really what life's about, life is about experiencing life from all sorts of different perspectives. So we know the experience of life with suffering infused in it, meaning suffering infused in the present moment experience. And teachings have told us that liberation, what is available, is the end of suffering. And the teachings will describe that the suffering that's being spoken about is not pain, that it will be referred to as pain. It's not unfortunate circumstance. That is also a form of pain. So financial pain, biological pain, emotional pain. Financial pleasure, biological pleasure, emotional pleasure. They are all parts of the circumstance, part of the daily life experience. So now that you know in each moment it is a daily life experience, and you can see that there are going to be components of the life experience. Like if you bang your knee with a hammer, you can do this just for the fun of it so that you can experience the present moment experience. Then you pick up a hammer and you go, oh, the present moment experience has me feeling the handle of a hammer and it feels heavy. You don't need to do it too hard. And bang your knee with the hammer. And in that moment, you'll be able to experience the experience of pain, pain in the moment. And then just to balance that out, go into the kitchen and have a chocolate cookie or an apple. And you can experience the present moment experience with a component of pleasure in the moment, assuming the apple isn't rotten. If you bite into the apple and it's rotten, you might think you were going to experience pleasure in the moment, but it was pain in the moment. Suffering is the attitude that we have towards the content of the present moment experience. And often the content of the present moment experience includes the other delivering the hammer hit to the knee, or the other delivering the financial pain or the emotional pain. And then the attitude towards that pain is, that is an attack on who I am. That attitude is what arises. The fact that you lied to me is an attack on who I am. And you lied to me, you delivered pain to me. I hate you because you, as the doer, you should have acted differently. So now we've forgotten that life is an experience. And we're saying, you are a separate independent doer. I am a separate independent doer. And that pain that you deliver is not part of the life experience, but it's pain that shouldn't be here. And you did it and you should have done it differently. So now I have an attitude towards the present moment experience where that it shouldn't be pain, it should be pleasure. And I have an attitude to the other in the present moment experience that sees them as the one that has designed the experience that way, has designed their actions to be a specific way, and that they could have designed it all differently, and that life could have been different. And our attitude is, I want life to be different. I don't want to experience that pain. And it's your fault. You caused it. So that's the attitude towards life. Let's say we have, lost our job or something, and we wake up in the morning. That's the circumstance. We've got some bills coming in. We don't have the money for the bills, so that's pain. It's stressful. It's destiny. It's the present moment experience. And the attitude towards that situation, the attitude to our situation can change how we feel about being alive. And that attitude is not separate from the experience. It is a component in the experience that you aren't creating. But what's interesting to see is that this attitude can make you wake up feeling heavy and down. And an alternate experience is where you don't have a job because the situation in the world has meant you've lost your job, got bills coming in and you don't have much money left. And your attitude is one free of the heaviness towards the situation. It's possible. The teaching is not saying you have to change your attitude, you have to have a different attitude. It's saying you don't have control over the experiences. You don't have control over the circumstance or the attitude. Notice that that is how life is created. And as we notice, for example, that life is a present moment experience, as we notice that the components of the present moment experience are not something that I put there, and even the thoughts are not something that I become aware of the thoughts after they happen. So the more familiar we become with life as a present moment experience that has been created, the more likely we are to maybe have the thought that life is a creation unfolding exactly as it's destined to unfold. So at least from the point of view of the one aware of life, it unfolds and then there is awareness of it. And so we might start to see, wow, these things, the experience, the pleasure and the pain is unfolding according to God's will, we could say, or life's will, not my will. And the attitude towards how it's unfolding is also something I become aware of after it arises. And it can change. And then I'm aware of it having shifted. And so the more that this seeing life as experience arising moment after moment happens, the less involvement there is. That perspective is a movement towards witnessing life and witnessing suffering, not getting involved in the suffering, not resisting it as much as before. And if there is a resisting to the suffering, saying, oh, this suffering is an extra layer on top of the pain and it doesn't need there, it's all attitudinal. And so then there's an insistence that I need to change my attitude, which is getting involved in the attitude. Maybe there's a witnessing of that attitude to, I need to change the attitude. And we realize that the circumstance is part of life experience. The attitude of heaviness is part, and then the attitude towards the attitude of heaviness is all part of the experience, and something can watch it all. And the more that that is seen as a happening, all of it is a happening, the circumstance, so the pleasure or pain part of the experience, the suffering, if the suffering is there, the involvement in the suffering, that is the shift that we can call witnessing. And then as that happens, it becomes clearer and clearer that the primary suffering is involvement in circumstance, saying a thought, a resistance to the circumstance, saying, it really shouldn't be like this. Life is unfair. And if we see that that is the belief of attachment to outcome and the belief of personal doership, as it's seen more and more to be the root of all the different sorts of suffering, the guilt, the blame, the pride, all based on seeing myself as the doer in control of how I act, and seeing the other as the doer in control of how they act, and blaming the other for those actions that deliver pain to me, blaming myself for those actions that happen through me that deliver pain to myself or the other, feeling proud for those actions that happen through me that deliver positive results. That's the guilt, the blame, and the pride. And we'll feel that that is an uncomfortableness in the present moment experience. And if we see it's all based on thoughts of personal doership, just seeing it may be enough for that to be the way the experience unfolds differently. That might be one of the rules, that if life puts in to the experience the seeing that doership and attachment to outcome is the basis of suffering, then the next frames may be frames which include less doership and attachment to outcome in them. I say that this experience of life is not random, that things happen based on causality. So the story of life says, if on page 256, the flash is there, I'm not the doer of the actions and the outcomes. So I can't be the one that feels proud of those actions that deliver positive results. I can be pleased with that because those positive results are pleasure. So I will experience the pleasure. If someone says thank you, I will say, you're very welcome. I'm glad that it happened that way. But attitudinally, I can understand that it could just as easily have turned out differently if it was destiny for it to be different. I realize that the skill in that area of life is a result of one's genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the outcome is maybe linked to that skill set, or it could be complete good luck. Either way, I can't claim responsibility as the doer of that. I can only accept that I was the instrument through which it happened, and therefore I have to be the one that experiences the pleasure or pain in relation to that outcome. That is something that seeing we're not the doer doesn't absolve us of. We might see we're not the doer of the good actions or the bad actions, but we're still going to be responsible to society, or rather, society is going to hold us responsible. They're going to punish us for those actions that happen through us that deliver pain to society, and they'll reward us for those actions that happen through us that deliver pleasure to society. Attitudinally, the good actions, the actions that lead to positive outcomes, won't turn into pride. And those actions that turn into negative outcomes won't turn into guilt or shame. And if the other is delivering actions that deliver pain to us, biological resistance to that might arise. The body has its preferences. It prefers pleasure to pain. So there might be a biological resistance. However, in time, or horizontally in time, there won't be the attitude of hating the other as the doer of those actions that delivered that pain. And so if destiny creates that insight, I'm not the doer, everything is a happening, then the way that the story unfolds is such that life will probably create the end of hatred towards the other, the end of shame towards oneself. So what happens in that moment where blame and shame fall away, it's not some spontaneous happening that is completely unrelated to what happens before. It's like the author puts in insight on page 256, and then 257 unfolds given insight has happened on page 256. If insight doesn't happen on 256, then what happens on page 257 is in line with insight not having happened. So we could say that life is a creation. consciousness at rest, source, has at some point manifested. So infinite creative potentiality, which is the unmanifest consciousness at rest, at some point becomes consciousness in movement, potential actualized. And that's the story of life from the beginning of time to the end of time. And so we could say it's a story of forgetting oneself, forgetting one's true nature as consciousness, forgetting that the person has at its core consciousness and awareness functioning through it. So life is a story of forgetting oneself, suffering as a result, because in that forgetting, we've lost the sense that we are connected to life, that we are being lived. And so therefore suffering arises because this is a story of cause and effect. So if life puts in the forgetting, if life puts in the false sense of self, then what follows is suffering, which is the manifestation of not knowing oneself. Suffering is the manifestation of thinking we are the doer and that our happiness is to be found in outcomes. Then life puts in place spiritual seeking, puts in place various teachings, and those teachings deliver concepts, and then contemplation happens, and maybe meditation happens, and taking time off work and going traveling happens, and going to retreats happen, and long are changing, insights are happening. That's all part of the unfolding of the story of life, exactly as it's destined. And as those insights happen, which are not your doing, but happenings as part of the story of life, then what follows after that are outcomes, especially on the attitudinal level, that are in line with the realizations that are happening. And those realizations, if they are realizations that are relevant to the end of suffering, mean life continues to unfold with less suffering. And eventually, if the ignorance, if the not knowing ourself, which essentially in this teaching is the belief in personal doership and the belief in attachment to outcome, fall away completely, then life has to create experience that follows on from that, which means still the living as a human being, doing whatever has to be done in each moment, which is really destiny unfolding, continues to happen, but without the attitude towards life of doership and attachment to outcome, which really means in practical terms, the absence of guilt and blame and pride and worry and expectation. Understanding life is an unfolding according to God's will. So no need to resist what happens in life. Biologically, there will be resistance. If someone started spraying hot water on me, biologically, the body is going to move out of the way. Hey, that's hot water, can't you see? It's dangerous, be careful. That's a biological reaction. The understanding is it was destiny for that to happen, and destiny for me to move out of the way, destiny for me to warn them, to shout at them, to get angry with them. And destiny was that you really get scolded, have to go to hospital. It's understood that that was pain in the moment. The other was the instrument through which that pain was delivered. And attitudinally, no hatred for the other, no blame. You shouldn't have acted that way. Now, sure, biologically, what they did was unsafe. What they did caused a negative outcome. The same if someone breaks into the house and hurts someone I love. On a biological level, I say, of course, I wish that didn't happen. It creates emotional pain to see someone that I love hurt. But attitudinally, I understand this is life unfolding, that life is a mix of pleasure and pain, and that hating the other is going to add a load of suffering into my life experience that doesn't change the fact that someone I love has been hurt. It doesn't prevent me from reporting the situation to the police if I know who the other is or have a suspicion who the other is. I will do everything that feels natural or everything that comes up. And what could come up is, suggesting that it's possibly that person. Now, that doesn't have to be coming from hatred. That's a biological reaction that makes sense given the circumstance. And yet, if the other person isn't charged or isn't found, I know that the unfolding of life is not in my control. So you need to do your best, do whatever you think or feel to do. If it is not inspired by hatred, then that's great news for you because there's no suffering in that moment. And understand the outcome not in your control. So the person might get away with it. You might even see them using some of the stuff that was stolen. And the police have investigated. They say there's no proof. You have no proof to give them. And the situation goes unchecked. The person goes unpunished. And hatred is an attitudinal thing towards life. Like life shouldn't have turned out that way. I hate you for what you did. It's very natural if it happens. It's very understandable. But it's natural based on the deeply ingrained belief of doership and attachment to outcome. If that falls away, then the biological pain will be there. I won't love the person in the sense that I'll invite them round for dinner. Got no interest in having them come into the house. It's not someone that I like. It's not someone that has delivered pleasure to us. In fact, the opposite. But that doesn't mean I have to live my life thinking about what happened in the past, hating the person for what has happened. And that applies for very extreme situations as well. The principle is the same. I can understand that this is not something to achieve. This is not something that we can force ourselves to do. We can't prevent hatred arising. We can't help regret arising. If life undoes the doership, then that is a happening that life puts in place. And then hatred and regret can't arise. But to insist on hatred not arising when in fact life leaves the belief of doership and attachment in place is just going to create frustration, because that hatred, that regret, that pride, that expectation of life being a certain way will be there because the beliefs are in place. And so if the suffering arises, then we can go, the suffering is arising because my genes and up-to-date conditioning include the belief of personal doership and attachment to outcome. So in the experience of life, if suffering is there, especially in seeking, if seeking has become suffering, then understand that the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome is in place, but understand is destiny unfolding. So it can be seen. There can be a contemplating about it, but that is also components of the momentary experience when they're happening. Contemplating is happening. Roger is being contemplated, being lived. Okay, we'll take a few questions. Hi, Oleg.
Hi. I want to ask you about non-doership.
Yes, go ahead.
How to not how to not identify with doer?
Yes.
When I doing some work, I think I'm doing it, but how not identify with it, with the doing?
Yeah. So when, let's say you're building something or painting something, painting a room, clearly painting is happening, right? We can't deny that.
Yes.
You are putting the paintbrush in the paint and then putting the paint on the wall and lots of little tasks, and that is all happening. So what does it mean you are not the doer? Because painting is happening for sure. And who is painting? Oleg is the one holding the brush and painting the room. So the non-identification really means to see that what I thought was a very personal activity, because Roger or Oleg is the one moving the brush around and doing a good job or doing a messy job of painting the room. If it's understood that I will be able to paint the room to the extent of my biological makeup, if I have shaky hands, then I'm going to get paint on the window frame. And if I have very steady hands, I can get it so that it is very nice and straight. And whether I have shaky hands or steady hands is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. So what I think is my doing, it's definitely happening. The painting of the edge of the windowsill is happening. If it's a good job or a bad job is a result of destiny, a result, and destiny unfolds based on, what life has put in place before that. So life has created me to have shaky hands, so I don't get the window done very well. And say, before that, I decided on what color to paint the room. And I decided I want to paint it orange. And so I went to the shop and picked orange paint. And so I start painting, and someone comes into the room and says, "What are you doing? Why are you painting the room orange?" And I go, "Oh, white is like a bit boring, and I want to try and be creative." And the person says, "Yeah, but it's not very nice." And so you see that you made the decision based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning, based on your capacity that thought in that moment, it thought, yeah, orange is a great idea. And so if everyone says, it's not very nice.
But it's my idea. Idea is mine. Idea of orange painting is mine.
Well, it happened through Oleg, right?
Yes.
The thought you can say is Oleg's thought. But when you think about it, or when you look at it, Oleg can only think a certain way. He got given a brain, and the brain was not something Oleg created. And then he, grew up in a family, and let's say your family liked really bright colors. Your dad thought that painting everything orange and yellow is great. And so you have a brain, and the brain gets conditioned by your environment. So you're forced to have the thought, let me paint the room orange. So it's your thought, but you couldn't think anything else because your biological makeup was influenced by your genes and your up-to-date conditioning. And so that thought is Oleg's thought, but attitudinally, we can look at it like Oleg didn't create it, because Oleg is designed to function only one way in each moment. So this is the seeing this, like really understanding it. right? Not just understanding it in theory, but next time you are painting a room and you pick orange paint, you realize I pick orange paint because my dad liked green and blue paint and orange paint.
But
And
what
now
if I take not orange, green?
Mhm.
It's my thought.
It's the same principle. It's, of course, you bought it because you thought, I think I want to paint the room green. But that thought comes from your genes and up-to-date conditioning.
No, I change my mind about orange for green.
Mm.
It's my thought.
No, both the initial thought, I want orange, then you say, I want green. All of your thoughts are, you could say, Oleg's thoughts, because they're happening because of Oleg's genes and up-to-date conditioning. So they're Oleg's thoughts, but Oleg wasn't in control of the makeup that created that thought. So this is the paradox. It is Roger's thought, but Roger isn't the doer of that thought. Roger isn't in control of that thought. It happened according to Roger's genes and up-to-date conditioning, and Roger wasn't in control of his genes and up-to-date conditioning.
Basically, I don't exist.
Well,
like
I didn't
independent.
say
Like
okay,
independent.
yes. You don't exist as an independent entity, correct? You do exist as an expression of life. Roger exists as an expression of life.
But there are no individual in there.
Well,
no individual.
No, Roger is an individual. I'm just not independent from life. But I am. It depends on what you mean by your wording individual. I would say Roger is a person, and this person is separate from the other person. We're not the same. So Roger is an individual compared to the other individuals, the other person, but each individual is connected to life. Each individual is not independent from life. So we are individuals in that we are different from the other, but we are not separate from life.
But there doesn't exist. But other individuals doesn't exist like I.
Other individuals don't exist, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, you just need to go out into the street and you'll see other individuals existing, no? They don't exist as independent doers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Independent doers.
Yeah. So it's this, this is where the, spiritual seeking can get a bit tricky when we sort of say, oh, I don't exist, the other doesn't exist. And we say that because we realize, oh, I don't exist in the way I thought I existed. When we see that I am what seems like my choice of green or red colored paint is really a happening. And so on one level, we say, I don't have a choice. I will only pick what I pick because of the thoughts and feelings that are there. And then I see the thoughts and feelings come from my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And there are other ways of exploring this, so other teachings will use other explorations. And then we suddenly have an insight like, oh, I don't exist as I believed I existed, because we had an image that Roger is a separate, independent doer. And that when he has a thought, when he has a choice, it's my thought and my choice, and I could have chosen anything in that moment, and I chose that. That's the idea we have of ourselves. And then in this moment of insight, we see that doesn't exist, that identity, that that's an imagination. And so the imagination collapses, and then we say, I don't exist. That's gone too far. What we can say is, what I thought I was never existed. You know, what I thought I was doesn't exist. But then what's left? Well, what's left is what was always there, which is Roger functioning. It was our imagination, but Roger still exists. So it's just a matter of refining, I guess, how we relate to ourselves. So thank you, Oleg. I hope that answers your question for now.
Thanks.
Hi, Chris.
Hear me now?
Yes, I hear you.
Oh, good. First time I've used it, so that's good. I just sort of run across you, and most non-dual type teachers tend to be fairly nihilistic in their view, but you seem to be fairly up to speed with the kind of middle way approach, or the interdependent approach.
Right.
So that's refreshing. I was wondering, yeah, and you also mentioned, I noticed in a video, I think it was you were talking about Ramesh and you agreeing on the fact that although you say we don't have free will, as you've kind of been alluding to on a couple of levels, but I mean, yeah, we're propelled kind of by the our ultimately altruistic, I suppose, instincts ultimately, but you do say we have free will nevertheless. So I've never been able to work this out because logically I can't quite get there, although my teachers have always told me that you do have free will. But I also get the logic that, well, you know, if you're acting out of a previous cause and, as you say, your biological setup that you were born into, which would be propelled by karma from a previous rebirth as well, for those two things to actually be able to happen. So I was just wondering, yeah, where does the free will, where is that little bit of room for the free will?
There isn't any, as free will as a you know, as a sort of, if someone says, well, you have some free will, I think that's wrong. You either have complete free will or no free will. And the thing is that there are certain levels, or no, certain aspects of our understanding that are like different strings of understanding, let's say. And one string is where we have to see we are not the doer, and there's absolutely no free will, no individual free will, because that's where we start off. The main misunderstanding is believing, you know, I'm the one deciding my destiny. Essentially, I'm the one that is you know, making all the choices are my choices. And what that means is we see ourselves as this independent entity with complete volition, meaning I can choose whatever I want in this moment. And that attitude needs to be eradicated because it's too extreme, in a sense. It's too, and it's off the mark. It's the basis of which all our suffering exists. Somehow we seem to think that that's a great, you know, idea of ourself, that I'm the one that makes my life happen. It's really just about control, because we're, you know, when suffering is in place, the sense of control gives us some sense that there's some hope. I can maybe dig myself out of this hole. So we want control. The truth is that if we have control, if we have free will, it's that attitude that allows all of the human suffering to arise. When we see that suffering stems from the belief that we are separate objects, separate entities, because that's what free will really means. Free will means we're separate. If you're not separate, you're not free. And so the idea that I have free will means I am a separate, independent entity. And then teachings come along and say, you know, it's separation. It's the idea of separation that causes suffering. Life is not separate. You are not separate. Life is not duality. It's non-duality. And liberation is the end of separation, meaning the end of your perception of separation. And so as we start to see what this perception of separation is, we see it's illusory. It's a projection onto life that breaks life up into many different parts, which are not really separate. So, you know, if we look at an event, we say, okay, the event started at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, and that's when the outcome that happened at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, it was part of this event that started at 8 o'clock on Monday morning. Whereas the truth is that 8 o'clock was a result of 9:59 and 59 seconds that turned into 8, that turned into 8 and 1 second. An event doesn't really have a start point in the way that our thinking mind that separates everything thinks it does. And so as that thinking that separates life when in fact it's not separate, as that thinking falls away, we start to realize life is not separation. I am not separate from life, and that what I do is part of life, and what the other does is part of life, which is why teachings say, you know, if you hate the other, you're hating yourself. If you hate life, you're part of life, then you're at war with life and you're at war with yourself. And if you're at war with the other, you're at war with life, you're at war with yourself. So on that level, we have to come to see that we have no free will as we imagined it. And that can change our attitude to, you know, the things that happened in the past. We're carrying this load of shame towards things that went wrong in the past because we believe that we were the doer, we could have done it differently, we should have done it differently, it was my fault, and everything that followed afterwards was all my fault. And if someone comes along and says, you know, that's destiny unfolding, that's God's will, life is, you don't know what the big picture plan is, and that something like that can turn into something very positive. And if someone gives you permission in a way to drop that load of shame, if it happens, if it's grace for that attitude to kick in and go, really, it's not my fault? Go, no, you couldn't have acted differently. You were doing your best, even if your best wasn't, in hindsight, wasn't very good. You may imagine in that moment you were doing your best. You were doing what you thought was going to be best, based on your ability to assess the situation, and that ability might have been impaired by the craving for drugs, let's say, and you stole money to buy drugs because you thought that was what was best, impaired by a very strong craving for something. And you couldn't have done it differently. And that can release a huge amount of shame and guilt. So that's the seeing we're not the doer and how it changes our attitude. With that changed attitude, we can't ignore the present moment experience. So even if we see I'm not the doer, because in each moment I'm functioning according to my design, and that's not in my control and it's limited. And even once I've functioned, the outcome is not in my control. That's attitudinally means the end of suffering if that understanding, if there's a complete surrender to being lived, to seeing that in each moment I'm functioning according to God's will or Roger's design. But in the moment, in experience, there is the feeling, even with this deep understanding. So I know on one hand, everything is happening. And in practice, it feels like I am the one choosing. I open the fridge and I don't feel like God is insisting that I choose the cheese. And I go, no, but God, I don't want to choose the cheese. I want the yogurt. Come on, let me have the yogurt. No, you have to take the cheese. Ah, damn it. Okay. That's not our experience. In experience, we open the fridge knowing that we're opening the fridge because it's destiny, open the fridge because of the date conditioning, opening the fridge because hunger arose that moved me towards the fridge. So we know all of that in theory. And in practice, I open the fridge and I feel like I have complete free will to pick whatever I want. I look at the orange juice and then I look at the coconut water and I'm going to have the coconut water. And it feels, the feeling in the moment is that I am completely free to pick whatever I like. And that's the feeling of free will in the moment, which is a gift, which needs to be acknowledged as the actual experience. And then hopefully we have the understanding that the feeling of free will is what we have in the moment. So we can say, in practice, I have complete free will to pick whatever I want. I know, however, that what I pick and that feeling of free will is a result of life, having created human beings this way. And I will pick the orange juice or pick the coconut water because of how I feel, which is not in my control, because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which might include someone, having gone to the doctor and the doctor says, your blood sugars are a bit high, so I think you shouldn't drink as much orange juice as you say you drink. And so we pick the coconut water instead. And when we're picking the coconut water, we go, I have complete free will to pick whatever I want. But then I realize I'm picking the coconut water because of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, which includes the conditioning from the doctor. And that's the paradox where I know that nothing I do is my doing. It's always outside of my control. And yet in practice, I live as if I have complete free will because in practice I do.
Okay. All right. So, if, for instance, you're probably familiar with Tantra and probably familiar with the death process. So if you imagine the mind gradually disillusioning, so it's going down through the death process, or when you go to sleep or when you faint. And so your gross levels of mind, like your conceptual mind and cognition and your various other functions that come from the body are stripped away. And then you go into pure naked awareness, which is unadulterated. And so for someone who's accomplished, they can stay in that pure state for as long as they want, right? And a tantric practitioner can then generate volitionally or freely the ability to arise as, say, the bodhisattva of wisdom or of compassion or whichever they choose, because they've got the ability to strip down to that naked awareness where there are no predispositions. But because they've trained their minds to be familiar with that state, as you know, it's like being familiar with the knowing as opposed to being the projected self. So you're not relating to the projected self. So similarly to that, but in a deep, deep level. And then they can arise as whatever. And then that's kind of like their primary projection into the next rebirth or next life form where they go to serve or help sentient beings. Whereas ordinary beings are just propelled by their karma because they haven't got that ability. They're just panicking or whatever, and so they just grab onto the next thing or wherever they can find some sort of safety or sense of just want to be me again, just want to feel in control again. And also reason itself. Like if I say, okay, tomorrow, out of reason, despite my preconceptions and my desires, or I'm going to take these 10 vows, and I'm not going to, so I won't kill, I won't steal, I won't commit adultery. You could take on your 10 bodhisattva vows or whatever. And then because you've taken those vows, so now I'm forecasting what I'm going to do tomorrow, or even I'm just going to set the alarm at 7 o'clock and I'm going to get up at 7 o'clock. So there seems to be some sort of space, nevertheless. Now you can argue that, oh, well, what's making you make those decisions? Why did you decide to set the alarm? Was that a choice? But when it comes down to that subtle mind, and you're not relating as the self, and you're not being projected by propelling karma, that's sort of, you're on autopilot, but you've got that space to drop back into those deeper states where you really don't have to do anything at all, ever. Because but you will, because ultimately there's a higher, and this is the point, I suppose, there's a higher way of being than just being, which is being with others and trying to help them to be in the same freedom that you're in. That's because we're not ultimately separate. And so therefore it makes sense that serving others is going to be better than just being alone and ignoring them all. It's like you can't be happy if your mother's drowning. If you're lying on the beach having a good time, she's out there drowning, you're going to be feeling a bit. So similarly, there's a because of the conditions, you will naturally be wanting to be out there and helping or being involved rather than just being in bliss all the time. So again, yeah.
So you just said because of the conditions.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah.
So something there is always a precondition that. So it's in. Sorry to cut you off, but otherwise I'll lose.
Okay. Yeah, sure.
What's happened is a type of conditioning that moved us before might fall away, and then we might think, oh, now I'm not conditioned anymore. I'm free of conditioning. But actually, I would say that it's only a very specific type of conditioning that has fallen away. A type of conditioning that might have created a compulsive movement. And instead of that compulsive movement, we find what we might call a conscious, being conscious of the options. And often that is described as real free will and real volition, because you're no longer propelled because of conditioning that is creating this impulsive movement, which essentially eliminates all other options, and you are being forced down a particular path because of that conditioning. And so when someone's life experience changes, meaning the experience of how they make decisions changes from that compulsive, what would in those teachings would be called reaction. You are living life in reaction to response. That I'm sure you've heard that. That's how they will tend to describe the difference. Is you are first driven by a reaction, moves you in one direction, and you essentially have no choice. And the alternative is where you get to be conscious, they would say, conscious of your options, and then you make a conscious response to a situation. In my way of seeing it, you're still being driven by your genes and your up-to-date conditioning. It's just that your genes and up-to-date conditioning has changed, such that your conditioning no longer life, which is sort of the new conditioning that becomes part of your up-to-date conditioning has allowed you to be more considered in what choice you make. But that choice is still, according to me, based on your genes and up-to-date conditioning. We don't realize that or accept it or recognize it when we have a very specific definition of conditioning. And often the conditioning is usually pointed at as fear, let's say, some conditioning that sets in place fear. The truth is that your speaking-based conditioning, the way that you know how to drive a car is conditioning, the fact that you know how to walk is all conditioning. So if we had our conditioning removed, we wouldn't be able to function in life. We would be inoperative. So the bodhisattva is far from free from conditioning. They're just free from a certain conditioning of false sense of self, which then means that they move in life differently, but still according to God's will, as the concept in this teaching.
Okay. Yeah, I mean the technical explanation that is given is that they're actually moved according to their previous prayers, like they've prayed to be of ultimate benefit to all beings or to attain enlightenment, and therefore once they go over the line, then they're projected by that. Yeah, I just thought that you'd said at some point that there is still free will, but you're just saying it's just the idea of the sense of free will. It's not actually a reality, or it's not actually what's really happening. So I guess that's your position.
Yeah, there's a feeling of free will, but even, all teachings need to be transcended, right? So once the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome has dissolved, which is really an attitude that forces suffering to arise. If someone said, do you really believe you're not the doer? I'd say, well, I know, that explanation of non-doership is, it's a very practical explanation that you can look at. And it's very simple. It says that, the person is always functioning according to their genes and up-to-date conditioning. That's the concept. And so I think that holds true as far as I can see. It's not a way out concept. It's really a pretty simple explanation. There's no other factors other than your genes and up-to-date conditioning that result in your biological and psychological movements. And yet I'd say, well, the truth is that Roger is both the biological instrument, being the mechanical body that has genes and up-to-date conditioning, and Roger is the awareness that is aware of whatever the body-mind organism does. So Roger is a result of, Roger is a combination of the mechanical instrument and the awareness. They're not two things. And so I also have to say, well, Roger is doing the speaking, the speaking is happening through Roger. It's Roger, which is the part of Roger is the body. The body is speaking. The body is painting. The body is, driving the car. So on the other hand, I say Roger is doing it. Roger is no one is forcing Roger to do anything. So Roger is doing it. So Roger in practice has complete free will over whether he turns left or right. Roger has complete free will over whether he eats a healthy meal today or an unhealthy meal. That's a valid perspective, given that Roger makes the choices and I am Roger. But at the same time, when I'm advocating that point of view, I also say, yeah, but Roger can only make the choices that mechanical aspect of himself that is thinking and picking is conditioned to make. So I'm I wouldn't say, yes, you have free will to avoid a misunderstanding that can kick in, that gives someone an excuse to be irresponsible, gives someone an excuse to be complacent in life. And so a teaching will say, you have a certain amount of free will to overcome that misinterpretation of the seeker, a seeker who might think it's okay to be selfish because I have no free will, and I'm saying, don't mistake this as some excuse to act badly, because the fact is that's not going to prevent you from getting in trouble. So it's no point saying to the judge, but it's, I'm not the doer. The judge goes, I understand you're not the doer. I'm not the doer either, but you have to spend some time in prison. And so I'd be saying to a seeker, don't allow the concept to become a misunderstanding in your system that gets in the way of your functioning and turns your functioning into irresponsible functioning. If that happens, well, that's destiny, because it was destiny for them to hear the concept, destiny for them to process it a certain way, and destiny for that to encourage them to be selfish or complacent or irresponsible. And when it happens, then I'd say, yeah, well, he was just acting according to his genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the up-to-date conditioning included listening to the teaching.
Yeah, I guess we can't explore it too much more than that, but that's the sort of point, isn't it? Like if you do accept it in an extreme way or in a full way, not even just using it as an excuse to act badly, but say if you're in a lot of pain, you might think, well, I'm just gonna, blow my head off because, I'd rather test that out than not. And according to some teachings, but I don't know myself, that would be negative because you're likely to enter into even more pain, or you're going to have to experience it in some other way or whatever. So it's not necessarily an escape. But yeah, there's a few consequences of giving over full responsibility, but you've kind of covered that by saying you better to accept that there is some responsibility, and it definitely feels better if you just say, I'm just going to lie in bed today because whatever happens. There's an automatic sort of sickly feeling about that. Yeah, that's all I have to say, I suppose. But thank you.
Yeah.
Very clear.
You're welcome. Thanks for dropping in.
Thanks.
I think that about wraps it up for the day. So till next time, peace.